Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn, and I run the services at MedComms and the associated websites. So information, resources, services, activities, and so on for people who work across the global community of medical communicators, medical educators, medical publishers, people who work in and around those businesses. There's lots going on. If you go to medcommsnetworking.com, you'll find the details of what's happening and what has happened. We do generate a lot of video content through webinars like this. You'll find over at NetworkPharma TV, there's more than 500 videos now, so all sorts of useful content to have a look around at if you've not seen it. Also, specifically, a shout out for anybody in the audience who is interested in joining MedComms, maybe as a medical writer or an account manager or whatever. So we do provide a lot of information about working in MedComms over at firstmedcommsjob.com. And there's more. So go and have a look around the resources and give me a shout if I can help anybody. In the meantime, these webinars are great. It means we can get people from all over the world talking about topics of interest. We've got another great international audience online today with us. So thank you very much for joining us. And I'm really pleased we've got the guys here from AMICULUM, and we're going to talk about early and adaptive strategic planning for successful launch, and looking specifically at cell and gene therapy. But I won't take your thunder, guys. I'm going to hand straight over to you, James. So take it away.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Peter. So good afternoon or morning, everybody, depending where you're dialing in from. And welcome to this AMICULUM webinar on the role of early and adaptive strategic planning in product launch success, where we're going to put a particular spotlight on the area of cell and gene therapy. We have around 10 slides to walk through, which should take about 30 minutes or so. So we should have plenty of time for discussion, and we'll open the floor for questions at the end. Now, before we get into the details, just to briefly introduce ourselves. So all the panelists today are from AMICULUM. Now, AMICULUM is an independent healthcare communications and consultancy business that's been around for over 20 years now. It employs around 350 people across 9 countries worldwide and has 11 specialist agencies shown across the bottom of the screen here. Now, among those agencies are Evida, our team specializing in strategic brand planning, Seacrest, our agency specializing in genetically informed healthcare, including cell and gene therapies, relevant for today, and our Access team, which focuses on access reimbursement and value communications. And we're joined today by panelists from each of these agencies. So I'm now going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, please. So Mansa, over to you.
Thank you, James. Hello, everyone. My name is Mansa. I'm a senior consultant and editorial lead at AMICULUM Access. I've been at Market Access for just about 8 years now, 4 of those with AMICULUM, and my role is to look after our writing team here at Access and our scientific expertise, but I also look after some of our key accounts, including rare disease and cell and gene therapies. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Mansa. I'm Steve North, so I'm from Seacrest, which is our cell and gene therapy and genetically informed healthcare specialist team. I've been in MedComms for about 12 years, with Seacrest for about 5, and I'm involved in leading a team of medical writers and ensuring scientific direction. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Choi, and I'm a strategic consultant at Evida. I've been working in pharma consultancy about 7 years, with focusing on landscape analysis and strategic insight generation. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Jess. So yeah, hi, everybody. My name's James Aird. I have a background in pharmaceutical strategy consulting. I was at the IMS Consulting Group, now IQVIA, prior to joining AMICULUM, and in the AMICULUM company, I work with Jess in the Evida team. So with that, let's take a look at what we're actually going to be covering in this webinar today. So first topic really is about how early strategic planning and decision making can impact product success. So we're going to look at what that means, and we're going to look at examples of that. We're going to discuss what can get in the way with that, and the barriers that can be there and how we can potentially address them. And we're going to put a spotlight on the very interesting and still emerging area of cell and gene therapy. And if time allows, we'll hopefully touch on the role of strategy implementation and adaptation in success. So before we get into the details of all of that, Steve, as our representative from Sequest, could you please explain a little bit about why cell and gene therapies are in the spotlight today?
Sure. Thanks, James. So, yeah, cell and gene therapies represent a major expanding market in pharmaceuticals. So at present, there are 27 cell and gene therapies approved across the US and Europe. And the FDA is expected to approve 20 per year from 2025. And that doesn't really cover even the vast pipelines that are currently in development. So a really, really large area at the moment. Often the developing companies are small startups, so they can be inexperienced with major product launches. And with this in mind, there is substantial risk in their development due to the high cost of R&D and manufacturing, and often a small market that they will enter, particularly for rare diseases. So this provides an opportunity for us as agencies to provide value, but also means that the companies can be fearful of making substantial investments, especially if they're focusing on one main lead product that they haven't yet brought into the clinic. And together with this, these therapies present value and benefit uncertainties, with novel and sometimes bespoke market access approaches needed to secure backing of payers. And the companies often have to work with the regulatory agencies through approval routes that are still being established. So quite a lot of novel things that need to be considered with these.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Yeah, quite a lot there. We'll come back and touch on some of these points later on in the discussion, I think. So, as we said, one of the key themes we want to explore is the role of early strategic planning and decision making. So I want to start by taking a quick step back and looking at what we actually mean by this and why we're talking about it today. So obviously you see a kind of schematic of the development pathway here, and in order to get a product to launch, you have to make lots of decisions along the way, and that's difficult. There's no crystal ball. You're making decisions 5, maybe 10 years ahead of getting onto the market. Often, always pretty much with imperfect information about the market environment, the product itself, the competitors, the ever-evolving access requirements, and for a new area like cell and gene therapy, lots of new ground is still being broken with every product that comes through. So this is difficult. You don't even know if your product works, yet you need to start making these big decisions that will impact the commercialization path and ultimately success. Of particular note for cell and gene therapies, as we've shown here, many will use a slightly different development path, often with slightly condensed timelines, perhaps fewer patients, shorter studies, sometimes conditional approval, which certainly comes with benefits in terms of getting drug to patients, but can come with some added challenges. So to tie back to today's discussion, so by early strategic planning, we're basically meaning any major directional decision made along this journey that will have an impact on the ability of the product to deliver its goals and achieve what the developing company hopes it can achieve. And on our next slide, Jess is going to take you through some of those decisions.
Thanks, James.
There we go.
Yeah. So the product development and launch is an interconnected web of decisions and implications that over time lead your product down a certain path. At some point, typically during late-ish clinical development, the focus switches from what we are calling development focus towards commercialization focus, where the organization starts to shape plans for how they hope to bring the product to market. So early strategic planning during the development phase can have a huge impact on commercialization. And at the same time, those early strategies need to be continuously reviewed and adapted throughout the process. Hence the importance of starting early and adapting strategic plans along the way. Here we list some of the key strategic decisions during each period that can have a huge impact on product success. By any means, these are not exhaustive. And I'd like to highlight some of these key decisions we are going to focus on our discussion today. On the left-hand side, from development perspective, there are a couple of things I like to highlight. First, in terms of clinical trial design, there are many things to consider. Start with endpoints of your trial, meaning what kind of outcomes would you like to measure with your product? Then you think about comparators. Are you going to use a placebo as a comparator, or do you need standard of care as a comparator? Also, another thing to consider is dosing and administration of your product. And then you also think about what types of patients you would recruit in your study, which is usually defined by eligibility criteria. And last but not least, how to recruit these patients to your study. Another point here is about stakeholder mapping and engagement. So stakeholders include key opinion leaders. It could be clinicians, also patients and patient advocacy groups, or regulators and payers. You need to identify your target stakeholders and start planning engagement with them early. Then moving on to the right-hand side, commercialization focus. Again, I'd like to highlight a couple of points. First, it's about brand strategy and positioning. This is when you ask questions about where your product is going to play in the market and how you will get there. Then there is portfolio strategy and co-positioning, which is a level above individual brand. So what happens is often a brand is likely belong to a portfolio with other products, because if a company has chosen to invest in certain therapy area, then they like to maximize the return on investment by making the most of their knowledge, know-how, and relationships with the stakeholders they have gained from being in this space. So this brings some challenging and complex portfolio decisions of how do we co-position our assets. So all of these decisions and more are further complicated by the fact that many of them are interconnected. Not alone the process a long continuum with the clear boundaries, the companies really need to continuously adapt to ever-evolving market landscape as well.
Fantastic, thanks, Jess. So yeah, there's a lot to consider there. So next we're going to stay on this slide for a little while and pick up on some of those points to discuss between us all on the panel. So Steve, starting with you and thinking about the decision areas we've just highlighted, what would you say are some of the specific challenges in cell and gene therapy, and how can we help mitigate them through helping improve decision making?
Sure. So there's obviously a lot there. They each present different challenges in cell and gene therapy. One I'll pull out and focus on is clinical trial design and recruitment, as that's an area that we have some experience in. So trials for cell and gene therapies can often be complex, and that's both from a patient and a investigator perspective. And this is because they have stringent eligibility criteria sometimes, and this can include assessment for things like anti-vector antibodies that you might not see for a traditional medicine. There are requirements for specialist administration, which presents logistical challenges in terms of where the trial can take place and where patients have access to. There are complex screening regimens that can take months before a patient actually receives an intervention, and in that time it can give them a bit of leeway to consider their participation or not, and that can represent a recruitment challenge. Often some of these trials are non-comparator, particularly with rare diseases or novel technologies being examined in later lines, and this can require consideration of how a picture of efficacy can be built in combination with real-world evidence or historical registry studies. And while this is predominantly the case for gene therapies and rare diseases, now in oncology, with the use of cell therapy such as CAR-T, we're seeing challenges around the need for head-to-head trials with novel CAR-T therapies, as the existing ones become the standard of care, and this represents some complex ethical and cost implications for any developer. So with these challenges, considering them early and factoring them into a development strategy at the early stages, and consulting the right stakeholders can help with mitigating them, I think.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Interesting. I think we'll come back to a couple of those points as well. Mansa, to bring you in, so picking up on Steve's points around trial design, from an access perspective, what are the key considerations that companies need to be thinking of here?
Yeah, so as Steve mentioned, trial design is really important for a number of reasons. In the market access space, and particularly in rare diseases or genetic diseases, these might not be well understood when a company goes into developing a drug for this. Symptomology might be complex. What's happening on a molecular level might not be the same as what you're seeing in patient symptoms. And what's easy to measure in a trial might not be clinically relevant. So it's important to think about what is an appropriate endpoint to put in your trial and what are the outcomes that you're going to get with that. We've seen examples, say, in Alzheimer's disease, where a lot of phase 3 trials failed to meet their endpoint, and a lot of therapies failed to get approval because they couldn't show clinically relevant changes in their patients. So it's something to think about early. It's something to think about from a perspective of a regulator. If you get to an approval discussion and the regulator fundamentally disagrees with the outcomes that you've put in your trial, your drug is never going to get to a patient. So it's important to have those discussions internally, but also with the regulator to make sure that everyone's on the same page coming approval.
Okay, so I mean, trial design is clearly an important and complex topic, and there's lots of people that need to be involved in it, and this sort of broad ecosystem of stakeholders need to be considered. Steve, you touched on stakeholder engagement as well. Can you elaborate on the role of stakeholder mapping, stakeholder engagement, and touch on what impedes that within cell and gene therapy space?
Sure. So stakeholder mapping and engagement is obviously crucial when trying to develop any novel and complex technology, and to ensure an accurate picture of the disease landscape and how feasible adoption of the new technology is, and where it might be best suited. Smaller companies, I think, often are preoccupied with achieving the data that they need before considering wider stakeholders and who they need to have on board. And obviously there are many different stakeholders, but one group that I think isn't necessarily always prioritized early on is patients and patient advocacy groups. And in the same way that Mansa mentioned about consulting regulatory agencies early, it's also becoming more important to consult patients early. So I heard this described as being like building a car without considering the driver. And getting to know your future driver allows the organisation to mitigate any barriers to study participation from the start. So it can allow patient consultation on clinical trial protocols and informed consent procedures. And this means that there can be a more patient-focused study, and ultimately the development of treatments that patients actually want and they need, and are focused around those. And it can further consider the logistical challenges such as travel, clinic visits, cost of time off work, stress, anxiety, childcare, these kind of elements, and ultimately build a therapy collaboratively with patients, which can allow for more meaningful outcomes.
Okay, yeah, it's clearly an obvious and important stakeholder to consider from many perspectives. And I wonder as well about, all products start with an unmet need, and getting that patient perspective on the true burden of the disease could potentially be quite helpful here. So Mansa, can you speak to that and talk about some of the differences maybe between cell and gene therapy and more traditional therapies regarding the understanding of that kind of true burden of disease?
Yes, so I think in cell and gene therapies, particularly the burden of disease can frequently be misunderstood, or it's quite complex and not understood to its full extent. So if you think about the patient populations in rare diseases or genetic diseases versus more standard diseases, these are usually children or babies that have quite substantial disease burden. They could be in a wheelchair, they could have developmental difficulties, metabolism difficulties, etc. So not only do they have a huge disease burden, but they're not always able to articulate that burden to you because they are children. So you do get that secondhand disease burden from their carers. The other thing that is really common in rare diseases is that the carers are their parents, their grandparents, their family. So they're full-time carers that have a huge burden, not just in terms of costs and obviously taking their children to appointments, but also in terms of their quality of life. They're frequently stressed. A lot of them suffer from depression. A lot of them suffer from some symptoms as well, because these are genetic conditions. So it's really important to understand all aspects of the disease burden, because it is much more important than, say, in non-cell and gene therapy areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, lots to think about. Okay, time's ticking. So let's move on to the commercialization side and think about communications, maybe. Steve, what would you say are the key aspects then to consider from a scientific communication standpoint in cell and gene therapy, and the key challenges?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, scientific communication bucket is incredibly broad, but key steps will involve developing scientific messaging or a scientific platform early on, so that consistent messages and dating have been included across all subsequent materials and publications. Other valuable early steps, I think, can include presenting or publishing preclinical data or vector optimization data, which I don't think is necessarily always prioritized in the more traditional drug development publication pathways. And even manufacturing processes to build an understanding and trust in the value of the technology that's being developed. And for cell and gene therapies, this is something that differentiates them a bit more. Mm-hmm. And while sometimes forgotten or not invested in disease awareness, particularly for the rare disease indications, is invaluable for laying a groundwork for a product's data. So this can highlight an unmet need, and an emerging biotech can really cement itself and associate itself with a positive role in that disease area. Mm-hmm. Challenges arise a bit more, I think, with smaller companies when they don't often have specific functions established early on, and are running a bit of a skeleton operation. So some medical affairs functions, for example, aren't established until later on in development. So a lot of the traditional activities that would fall within their remit are run by teams who have a broad role, from investor relations through to patient engagement through to business development. So naturally, it's an area where potentially HSC can help them, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and from a pricing and reimbursement perspective, if we're in this commercialization phase and thinking about that, Mansa, what are the key considerations from a cell and gene therapy in that space?
Yeah, so the commercialization space is really where a lot of the market access considerations come into play. For cell and gene therapy specifically, in this phase, it's important to understand your routes to market. So you've done your trials, you've gathered your data. Now, what is the most appropriate route to take? Frequently with cell and gene therapies, as Steve mentioned, you have small companies, you have constrained budgets, and there might not be a lot of awareness of the regulatory landscape for rare diseases or for genetic diseases. So it's important to do your research and landscape that route. What kind of route are you taking? Is it going to be an orphan drug route? Are we talking about an early access approach, or is a standard access route more appropriate? Each comes with its own benefits and limitations. The orphan drug route is frequently more appropriate for a high price therapy, but it comes with extra data requirements. It comes with extra timelines. And particularly in Europe, we see that the orphan drug routes are frequently take longer for the drugs to get to the patient. So all of these are things that you need to consider carefully once you get to that commercialization stage. I will learn how to say that word. The other aspect really is thinking about what you can do to reduce decision uncertainty once you get to those discussions with regulators. So you've planned your route, you're talking to the regulator, you want your drug approved and given to as many patients as possible. But if you're working in a rare disease space or cell and gene space, it's very likely that you're going to have a very small patient population, and phase 3 trials really aren't an option for you. A lot of cell and gene therapies come out with phase 2 data only and very limited long-term outcomes. So you're coming to the regulator with a data gap, you're coming with a very big long-term outcome gap. And regulators really don't like the uncertainty of whether or not your drug is effective. So anything you can do ahead of time to make sure you're closing that uncertainty gap, whether that means modeling, thinking about putting in long-term outcomes to your trials, setting up registries for your patients, anything you can do to close that gap is going to help you in this commercialization stage.
Interesting. So, yeah, speaking of uncertainties, one thought occurs to mind is it, especially for cell and gene therapies, it's maybe not always about the data. I'm thinking of CAR T, for example. We've heard a lot about the complex manufacturing and logistical arrangements that need to go into delivering that as a treatment, which goes way beyond kind of normal, for traditional therapies. So how does that play out from an access standpoint?
Yeah, so logistics is a big stumbling block in cell and gene therapies. Frequently, they're really complex to manufacture, to store. They need to be infused in a very specific schedule. You need trained staff to do this. It can only be done in certain hospitals in a certain way. So there's a lot of logistical considerations that go into actually getting your drug into a patient, even if the drug is approved and technically available. And of course, more logistics means more cost, which regulators are massively averse to. So proactively planning, what are those logistics going to be like? What are the costs? And thinking about that treatment pathway will really help with your approval reimbursement decisions.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay. Thank you, everyone on the panel. There's loads here with loads we've touched on and loads more we could touch on. We could go all day. I think in the interest of time, we'll move on. We've only got a couple more slides for you, so I think we can wrap this up pretty quickly. Right, so Jess, you're going to take us through our next slide.
So as we have just discussed, drug development and commercialization can be incredibly complex, and there are many pitfalls and challenges on the way. But there is one key theme that we like to highlight. It's the gap arising from the transition from development to commercialization focus, which is rarely a clean handover. At this stage, the product seems still far from launch, and other teams have other more pressing priorities. And especially for smaller companies, it's quite common that all functions are not yet fully staffed, which can leave, again, bigger gaps. So for a larger pharma company with a greater pool of resources and standardized planning processes in place, this tends not to be such a big issue. But for smaller biotechs, many of whom are driving the cell and gene therapy space at the moment, this transition tends to provide the biggest sweet spot where they have a need, and we as an agency can support and add value as a strategic thinking partner. Any earlier, they might not have budget or focus, and any later, likely we're running around playing catch up. So in the next slide, we have a recent case study where some of those early strategic thinking has proven beneficial. Steve?
Thanks so much, Jess. Okay, so just going to briefly go through this as an example of a client we've been working with for the last couple of years. And they're a small biotech company who are trying to establish a foothold with one lead product. And they experienced some challenges at the early stage. So to set the scene a little bit, there's some key challenges here for them. One, they're small with limited funding until they have some data available. Their lead product is in a rare disease, and for some patients with this disease, they can manage their disease quite well with the standard of care. And along with this, there's a competing trial. So these have raised some recruitment challenges, and as such, the trial was open for more than 6 months. It didn't recruit a single patient, partly owing to the complex protocol, partly owing to the factors I just mentioned, and partly patient candidates possibly feeling uncertain about proceeding with a treatment like this when they feel they can manage their care quite well anyway. And one other contributor that there was a challenge was a lack of momentum behind the unmet needs that the company had been trying to meet with their product. They gathered some impactful real-world evidence on unmet need, but disseminating this in an effective way to build awareness can be quite challenging. If I could have the next slide, please, James. Thank you. So moving on to our approach, we considered the priorities to be investigation and patient education at this point about the trial, and to start improving their recruitment, and then some disease awareness campaigns to build momentum behind their unmet need messages. So just to give a bit more detail on these, the investigators only had a very technical and complicated protocol document for education on the trial. So our approach was to develop a simplified and engaging training resource to ensure the site coordinators were confident in understanding the trial and comfortable to discuss it with potential patients. The patients themselves only had a complex and quite intimidating ICF to read about the trial in real detail. So our approach was to develop an informed consent guidance pamphlet to accompany it that would communicate the key elements of the patient experience on the trial. So exactly what it would be like for them and the relevant bits of the trial that would impact them substantially. And this would help them to fully understand how it would feel to be in the study and therefore obtain true informed consent if they agree to sign. And finally, to address the unmet need communication challenge, we proposed a digital disease awareness campaign based around social media and supported by a tailored website that focuses on the core messages that the company wanted to drive. And this approach was able to easily build patient and HCP awareness and prepare the ground for their products. So hopefully that provides an insight into the typical way that we might be able to help a company navigate some early challenges. Back to you, James.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve, and thank you all. So that closes the presentation part of this webinar. We hope you all found it interesting and found something in there that piqued your interest. Thank you, Peter, for the opportunity to discuss this today. And with that, I'd like to open the floor for questions.
Brilliant, thanks, James. Okay, cool. If we lose the slides and just come back to us on video, that's great. Those of you in the audience, please do use the chat box or the Q&A box to share any observations or ask any questions. We've got some coming already, which we'll try and cover. I suppose I quite like this sort of presentation in the context of what I do at MedComms Networking, because it's very difficult to define what MedComms is, sort of thing, and a lot of the time it's sort of focused in on, I don't know, publications or events or whatever. What we're talking about here is a much broader spectrum of activity and starting at a much earlier stage. And I think I guess I would say most MedComms agencies don't get involved in some of the stuff that you've been touching on. And I just think it's interesting. You've got a family of agency groups there. James, I guess some of your role is specifically working on that sort of consultancy type project at an early stage and independent of the rest of them. But there's the opportunity for it to become a spectrum of activity within the family, isn't there? So that it's just interesting, I think, that people hear about this. I just wonder whether you've got a comment on that. Because that sort of working within the family, but also maybe presumably working with other suppliers and so on in the chain of action there. Do you see what I'm seeing?
Yeah, no, you're spot on. It's interesting, and from our point of view, it's part of the value that we can offer and try to offer our clients across the whole AMICULUM spectrum. Our role at Evida is very much the kind of bigger picture strategic thinking, and that can be the earlier stage brand planning. Typically, it's more pre-launch focused or even post-launch. corrective, perhaps. But it can, when it works well, blend very seamlessly with the more traditional communications programs, again, pre-launch, disease awareness, stakeholder mapping, engagement, etc. Everything we've spoken about, the trial side. Sequus have done some really interesting work there. The access side is a massive headache. Lots of, and one of the interesting things here, to come back to Jess's mind the gap point, is our work spans functions as well. It's not just talking to med affairs, or not just talking to commercial, not just talking to access, but increasingly, especially in the larger corporations, we're seeing an increasing cross-functional stakeholder interaction, stakeholder management aspect to the programs of work.
And again, that's an interesting aspect, isn't it? I mean, in particular, and I'm oversimplifying, but in the bigger companies, there's a silo type approach to things. I mean, it's interesting focusing on cell and gene therapy. I think you said, and I'm guessing that a lot of the time you're dealing with the smaller biotechs or whatever, where they haven't got those silos developed because they're not that big, sort of thing. And actually, the opportunity for an agency like yours to come in, or family of agencies like yours to come in, actually makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So we're only got a few minutes, so we're going to have to crack on a little bit. And again, audience members, do send you questions in. We'll try and cover some off. I want to pick up on one thing, and Steve, I'm going to bring you in. And it's being picked up in a couple of questions there. You talked quite a lot about the importance of involving the patients. In acknowledging the importance of the patients and so on, but I don't think you said very much about how that happened, and I'm just curious as to how you do that, if you do that directly, rather than simply saying we need to think about the patient. Do we involve patients? Do we involve patient advocates? And how does that happen in practice? Can you just talk a little bit about that particular aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that the industry is starting to bring on board. I think it's early stages as to how much is actually happening. I know that these smaller companies, especially those that are developing gene therapies in the more rare indications, especially those that have a pretty poor prognosis, have a great deal of engagement earlier on with the patient advocates, and that can really help to inform what they're doing. From our perspective, the biggest part of our work has been helping with making patients feel comfortable on clinical trials. And some of that has included parents of patients as well. So exploring that element of communicating with a parent about who has a severe disease who is entering into a clinical trial. So yeah, I think the crux of the point is that it's early days, and it's something that the industry is starting to adopt and focus a bit more on. So to answer your question, I think we need to watch the space a little bit as to how.
Okay. I suppose, but to pin you down slightly, I'm just curious, and I don't know the answer to this question, and there isn't a right or wrong answer, but I know that it's happening in some places now. I mean, would you, as an agency, consultancy, have a board of advisors, patient groups, whatever that you're involved in directly, or is it the biotech company that's got that? Or I just wonder how practically it works, because as I say, it's easy to say this, and it's, but I just wonder how the practicalities work. And I know in some places we're now building patient advisory groups in a way that wasn't happening until very recently. So again, I don't know what the position is at AMICULUM. Have you got just a comment on that?
I think there's definitely a direction towards patient advisory boards and that kind of thing. And then also, whereas traditionally we think about scientific messaging and scientific communication platforms, is starting to transpose that into a patient engagement platform or a patient communication platform as well, especially in the areas where the patient experience is so important for those rare indications, for example.
Okay. Sital came in, following the same sort of thinking. Sital came in quite early on with a question about talking about policymakers wanting diversity data considerations and things like that. Again, I don't know whether one of you wants to talk a little bit about that. How much is that coming into the design of the activity and the reporting of the activity, specifically addressing the diversity of patient groups and so on, patient types? Has anyone got a comment on that? Or not? James, come on, say something.
Yeah, good question.
Have you an observation?
It's yeah, it's something we actually don't have that much exposure to, would be my comment. And I come back to almost the silo point as well. The people don't understand it, but clin dev who are typically setting the study up and driving that aren't always, we're rarely their clients. And okay, in a smaller business, it's the cross-functional complexities of setting up a trial. Yes, Med Affairs has some involvement who might be our typical clients in that setting. And maybe it's a difference between larger corporations and smaller corporations as well. I guess to go to the cell and gene therapy standpoint, smaller corporations, smaller diseases, rarer diseases, you've got fewer patients to pick from. So you probably have to take what you can get to a certain
take what you get, sort of thing. Yeah. Okay, I get that. Again, these sorts of questions are interesting, and I'm not expecting simple answers, because it's like a bit of a minefield and it's opening up all sorts of. But it's the sort of thing that people are talking a lot about. And I just think that's interesting that these discussions are becoming part of what we do.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. Isn't it? It's one of those that's probably challenging, hard in reality to actually execute something that sounds like a great idea on paper.
Yeah. I wanted to pick up, was it Petra's asking the question? Let's see what you come back with on this one. What experience you have, if any, with AI-enabled stakeholder mapping tools? Again, you talked a bit about stakeholder mapping. It's an obvious question, I guess, is just quite how you do what you sort of mentioned, and specifically with the AI type tools that are coming through. Again, a comment on that front?
Yeah, funny enough, it's been in discussion. There were a few discussions recently in the last week or two, in a couple of different areas. Something that we're looking at is probably the best way to describe it. It's not something that we've traditionally done a lot of, but it's an increasing level of awareness that this is a thing now, and there's ways of doing it. So yeah, it's definitely on the radar. We want to learn more. Okay.
Look, we're probably running out of time a little bit. I suggest, for the purpose of the recording, we draw the line there. Okay, guys. I think we've had an interesting overview of that, which has touched on all sorts of things. So thank you very much. I will make the point for you, as it were, on your behalf, that you're very happy to hear from people. LinkedIn is a very easy way of reaching out. So hopefully people online today, but importantly watching this later on, know that they can reach out to you. Do please keep the conversations going. But if you're watching this at the moment, don't run away if you're online, because we've got a few minutes to carry on talking. But let's draw the recording to a halt. Huge thank you to you panelists. If anybody wants to contact me, then it's easy to contact me via again, LinkedIn or medcommsnetworking.com is the place to go and look. But I think that was really interesting. I think there were a number of areas we could have gone off in different directions and had several webinars and all the rest of it. So thank you very much, and I hope people will follow up with you. But on that note, a little wave as we stop the recording. So thank you very much, and look after yourselves today. Bye-bye.